Thank you so much for joining us on a very, the first session of the IACC, the first start of the day. Looks like we're ready to begin, so if folks can just take their seats, we'll have Jen Lewis deliver some opening remarks.
No? Yes. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here on this first exciting day of the International Anti-Corruption Conference. My name is Jennifer Lewis, and I serve as a Senior Anti-Corruption Advisor and the Team Lead for Technical Leadership and Global Programming in USAID's first ever and brand new Anti-Corruption Center. I'd like to start out by welcoming you all here to this workshop on Countering Off the Flow, Tackling Strategic Corruption in Political Finance. And I'd like to especially thank the government of Lithuania for hosting IACC and for all of us here today. This is a timely event organized by Millennium Partners, which is USAID's implementing partner on our Global Accountability Program, which we launched last fall. 2.5 years ago, when President Biden unveiled the first ever US strategy on countering corruption, he characterized corruption as, quote, a disease that eats at public trust and the ability of governments to deliver for their citizens. This groundbreaking strategy, the first of its kind, also recognized the changes that we as an anti-corruption community have seen over the past decade, ones that all of you know well: the increasingly transnational and globalized nature of corruption, the worldwide reach and scope of corrupt actors, and their deep connections across our communities. And of course, corruption is increasingly recognized within global policy discussions as not just an economic threat, but as a political one that threatens the national security of countries around the world and seeks to undermine democracy itself. Authoritarian states have, of course, also recognized the power of corruption. For them, this is a highly effective tool to serve their own personal and political interests and to undermine democratic processes, spreading authoritarianism as a governing model. This weaponization of corrupt practices as a tenet of a country's foreign policy has come to be known within our community as, quote, strategic corruption. And while arguably corruption has always been strategically deployed by political actors, what distinguishes strategic corruption as we define it today is its seemingly intentional focus on not just siphoning off resources and furthering personal gain, but on undermining democratic processes and institutions. And that is why it has become today part and parcel of autocrats' playbooks around the world. Because this kind of corruption can be low cost, low profile, easily deployed, flexible and indirect, and tailored to any individual bad actor's priorities. For example, according to a report by our partners at the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, an organization that is closely linked to the Kremlin's solicited members of far-right parties in Europe, has put forward resolutions in their respective legislatures to lift sanctions against Russia. And according to leaked documents, the cost associated with bringing forth 2 of these resolutions was projected at just 20,000 euros, with a further 15,000 euros for each in case of successful voting. While the resolutions never actually passed, the targeted politicians did introduce them in Parliament, which shows the power of this kind of corruption. But as we have seen in Ukraine, Moldova, and other countries in this region targeted by this kind of strategic corruption, it is very challenging to counter this practice. This is especially true when information manipulation is used to twist the narrative and to paint any attempts to detect and neutralize strategic corruption as somehow anti-democratic. With elections taking place in at least 64 countries around the world this year, it is vital that we understand how malign actors are using strategic corruption and how we can most effectively strengthen our collective defenses against it. In particular, how do we protect political finance from manipulation and exploitation so that citizens can continue to have faith in the elections and political processes that define our democracies? How do we prevent malign actors from co-opting unscrupulous officials into advancing their objectives and pushing political discourse to extremes? These are issues we have been reflecting on deeply at USAID, and to which we have devoted new resources, both in terms of research and in terms of programming, under our new Global Accountability Program. For today's workshop, we have assembled a great group of experts, partners, and researchers to reflect on these important questions. And so I'm very pleased to introduce them. First, we have Maurice Nyambe, who's the Executive Director of Transparency International in Zambia. We're also joined by two fantastic Lithuanian women, Lina Petroniene, who is the chairperson of Lithuania's Central Election Commission. To my left is Ingrida Kerušauskaitė, I think I got that right, an affiliated lecturer at the University of Cambridge and the Center of Development Studies, and an international expert on financial crime and corruption, who also serves as the knowledge management lead on this project. Amy Cracker-Seltzer is a senior monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning specialist and an advisor in USAID's Anti-Corruption Center. And today's event will be moderated by my other colleague, Andrew Lawson, who serves as our anti-corruption and illicit finance specialist and as a project manager for the Global Accountability Program. So thank you again for being here today to discuss this important topic. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jen. It's a real pleasure to be here today and to be joined by such an esteemed panel of experts to talk about this very important issue. I expect today's discussion will be pretty wide-ranging. We'll look not just at strategic corruption trends within regions, across regions, but also some of the findings of the latest cutting-edge research in this field. And of course, we'll consider the problem on everybody's minds: what can and should be done to protect democratic processes and institutions from strategic corruption. How do we stop malign actors from exploiting weaknesses in political finance systems to promote and advocate their foreign policy agendas overseas? And we can jump right in and start taking a look at the current state of play with regard to strategic corruption. So, Ingrida, I'll turn to you for the first questions. Under the Global Accountability Program, Strengthening National Architectures activity that the USAID is working on right now, you are working on understanding what strategic corruption really looks like in Europe and Eurasia. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the things that you're seeing in the region?
Sure, thank you, Andrew. So first of all, I wanted to say that this work was made possible through the support provided by the Anti-Corruption Center in the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights and Governance of the U.S. Agency for International Development, as Jen mentioned. But the opinions expressed here are those of the Implementing Consortium's research team and individual researchers, and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Agency for International Development or the U.S. government. So we are working on building an evidence base on how malign actors have used and attempted to use strategic corruption, illicit finance, and corruption-related information manipulation to subvert democratic processes, to sow discord, and promote their interest in Europe and Eurasia. So essentially trying to understand how that happens. What are the attempted modalities that the stakeholders use? We're then looking at in what kind of context and what enables them to achieve their aims. So we're looking at what kind of vulnerabilities, for example, process gaps or lack of coordination between stakeholders, lack of data that malign stakeholders exploit. We're also trying to understand what can help mitigate such threats. So that can be processes, programs, or initiatives that have had success. So within the Europe and Eurasia region, we are seeing specific kind of vulnerabilities as well as strengths. So from the vulnerabilities perspective, I wanted to highlight three things. So first of all, historic and linguistic ties are being leveraged. There's strong penetration of Russian media in some countries and in some communities. There are legacies of international collaboration that are still existing. So in some countries, for example, the Border Guard Department of Russian State Security Services participates in protecting foreign borders. And there are historically interlinked economies and common trade agreements. So the second point that we've seen is that malign stakeholders exploit already existing challenges in the countries. That relates to anti-corruption frameworks and corruption framework effectiveness, collaboration between institutions, but also more broadly, social cohesion challenges. That might include ethnic and religious tensions, which present entry points for malign influence and strategic corruption activities. And third, we also see strong penetration of the Kremlin and Kremlin-linked companies, organizations in some markets in the region, particularly in energy, which can and has been used as a lever to influence policies in target countries, but also more broadly through investments in large-scale projects in key sectors such as mining, transportation, and telecommunications. And this economic coercion is part of a broader framework for malign influence, which is built on and maintained through strategic corruption. But we've also seen, particularly post-2022, very strong examples of energy independence, rapid move away from Kremlin-linked energy sources, gas and oil in many countries in the region. Some of those required significant investments prior to allow such a decision. In terms of strengths, I wanted to highlight two other ones. So first of all, countries in the region, particularly in the Baltics, have been very well aware of the risks related to malign interference and strategic corruption-related risks from the Kremlin. So this is nothing really new. It's been discussed a lot more, particularly since the 2022 escalation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine across the EU, but also since 2014, so the initial invasion of Ukraine, that did prompt a reevaluation, particularly in some countries and some industries, of Russian soft power influence, economic dependence, and potential illicit financial flows that are associated with that. And we've also seen very strong influence of international institutions' membership, such as the European Union, NATO, OECD, that was instrumental in establishing measures that can help mitigate strategic corruption. This includes establishing strong anti-corruption institutions, diversifying energy sources, and strengthening legislation. And we continue to see international review mechanisms, including GRECO, OECD, Moneyval, playing a positive effect on strengthening corruption mitigation frameworks. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Ingrida. Lena, I'd like to turn to you now. As a government official from a country that has certainly been at the focus of strategic competition over the last decades, how much of what Ingrida has to say resonates with you? And what are Lithuania's core concerns when it comes to strategic corruption?
Thank you. I suppose our geopolitical situation is, as a result, we have quite strict regulation of political campaigns financing and political parties financing. And we have donations, limits for donations. Not everybody can donate in Lithuania. Legal entities cannot donate in Lithuania. And we have transparency requirements and control over financing of political parties and political campaigns. And our situation, our system has changed several times. In the beginning, we started only with declaration of donations, no limits for donation. Later, were introduced limits. Later, illegal entities were banned. And to decrease risk of donating through natural persons, we were applied two kinds of limits for donations: absolute amount, and all donations are linked to declared income of donor. It helps not to donate too much. If you don't have enough money, you cannot donate too much in Lithuania. And not only income are controlled in Lithuania, also expenditures of political campaign are controlled. It helps us to decrease, funding through services for free, for discounts, through discounts, and there are some restrictions even for services like political campaign organization, like consultations, training, or legal consultations. You can buy these services only from Lithuanian or EU companies. You cannot buy it from Russia companies. It also helps us to prevent the interference from Russia. And I think that's all.
Thank you, Lena. So it sounds like there's certainly an awareness of the potential for political financing systems to be exploited, and enhancing transparency, ensuring that there's sufficient checks on the ways in which dark money can flow into the system. It seems like this is all based on a recognition that there is there is that, indeed, that vulnerability if, that exists. Let's maybe now jump to a different part of the world. Amy, USAID has been commissioning research about how strategic corruption has been manifesting in political finance and political processes across sub-Saharan Africa and also in the Middle East, North Africa region. Could you tell us a little bit about some of that research and some of the latest trends that you're seeing from it?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the studies that we've commissioned, these are studies that USAID's been working on in collaboration with implementing partners over the last couple of years that were conducted both in sub-Saharan Africa and across MENA, as Andrew mentioned. And the goal really was to better understand the kinds of regional dynamics of transnational corruption, with strategic corruption being a really central element of that study. And these studies across both regions have looked explicitly at political financing and the way that strategic corruption manifests in political financing. The data for these studies come from a whole variety of desk reviews of existing research and literature, as well as interviews with experts across both of the regions and key stakeholders. In terms of the big trends that we're seeing, there's a couple that I want to highlight. The first is that, unsurprisingly, strategic corruption is a very complicated phenomenon. We talk often about strategic corruption being the weaponization of corruption for particular countries' interests. And we do see some of that sort of direct one-to-one engagement, where we have countries that are, we have instances of international actors that are providing opaque political financing to target countries, making their way into their political processes. One of the things that the studies really pointed out was the importance of digging into particular parts of election financing and thinking about how financing is flowing to potential candidates. So, for example, in our Sub-Saharan Africa study, our case studies really highlighted the role of potentially foreign influence in funding primary candidates for elections, and the importance of looking at the nominating stages. Given the amount of financing that really goes into those preliminary parts of the electoral cycle, and this is particularly important in how candidates vie for safe seats when they're looking for party nominations. But one of the other things that was really highlighted across our studies was the multinodal systemic nature of these dynamics. We saw a bunch of trends, for example, of sort of circular financing, where domestic funds were laundered through the international system and recycled back into domestic politics. So, for example, in our Sub-Saharan Africa study, our case study suggested that this happens through links between natural resources funding and political financing. So that the illegal export of natural resources can be laundered externally and rechanneled domestically to support certain political candidates in the interests of other outside actors. In our MENA work, one of the things the study really dove in on was the different types of multinodal dynamics. So first you have these instances, obviously, where particular countries in MENA are targeted by external actors in terms of strategic corruption. This often happened through contracts and procurement processes. But one of the things that was really interesting about the MENA study and really important was looking at the regional dynamics and how strategic corruption played out through those. So, for example, the financial incentives for regional partners to push policies that were in favor of other MENA countries' political interests. Also, that there was a fair amount of strategic corruption from countries within MENA directed externally, outside of the region. Sometimes this was to curry votes in favor of particular policies. Sometimes it was to cover human rights abuses. So in a lot of ways, the networks that perpetrate and perpetuate strategic corruption are quite complex. One of the other things that really was highlighted across these studies was the way that domestic political economies shape the vulnerability to strategic corruption and the dynamics of how it actually plays out in practice. Across the studies, we saw that various factors such as the size of the economy, the ownership of the revenues from natural resources, the strength of civil society organizations really made a difference in how strategic corruption manifests itself. So some quick examples. In our sub-Saharan Africa case studies, we saw that there was a good amount of strategic corruption with the goal of controlling natural resources. But when you looked at the different case studies, the way that manifested was quite different. In one country that we were studying, we saw that there was less vulnerability to strategic corruption because domestic kleptocratic networks had really consolidated access to natural resources and were better positioned to, and coming from a position of strength to be able to dictate engagement externally. In one of the other case studies, we saw that there was greater vulnerability to strategic corruption because of the extent to which the diplomatic elites were really isolated. The political elites were diplomatically isolated, and there was a very fragmented political environment. So a lot of these domestic factors really played a critical role in how we think about strategic corruption and how we think about combating it.
Thanks, Amy. Maurice, I think it would be really great to hear your perspectives on the operating context in Zambia and help us understand the extent to which the concerns that we have heard voiced by some of the other panelists, both within Europe and Eurasia and Lithuania, and also other regions, are really kind of resonating as well. Like, do they look similar in Zambia? Are you dealing with of kind of divergences in some of the trends identified so far?
All right, thank you, Andrew, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this very important discourse. Maybe let me begin with what Ingrida mentioned about how existing weaknesses within different contexts are actually taken advantage of to sort of advance a strategic corruption. I think this is something that we have certainly seen in our context in Zambia, and I would like to highlight maybe two things that can relate to this. I think the first is that the lack of legislation to regulate political party financing, I think, is a big one, and it's the biggest weakness probably that I see within the context, and I think that has been repeated in the different interventions that our colleagues have made. Now, obviously, elections are a very costly endeavor. And so where you have a situation where political parties are not regulated in terms of where they source their funding, then I think that the risk and the vulnerabilities related to strategic corruption then is particularly high. There is a very interesting example that we saw in Zambia from a few years ago, where the then party in power, there was a court case that actually happened because cabinet ministers within that party had actually stayed on beyond the dissolution of parliament in the previous election. And so there was a court case as to the legitimacy of their stay in office. And the Constitutional Court actually ruled against them, and they said that they had to pay back individually for the allowances and the monies that they had gotten in that period. Now, there was a big debate in Zambia as to how they were going to pay back and when are they going to pay back. And then one day we just woke up and the party in power, I think it was the chief government spokesperson at the time, where they just announced that all the dues that were supposed to be paid had actually been paid for by a well-wisher. Now, it was very interesting because to this day, nobody knows actually who made that payment for them. And I think the suspicion was that this was a foreign entity. And so for us, this really just drove home the point that where you do not have clear regulation in terms of where parties should be able to source their funding, you get the potential to actually be captured in that sense. And I think that is the example that we saw. But another example also is stemming from the most recent report by the Financial Intelligence Center, which actually showed that foreign entities or foreign interests are actually registering local companies in Zambia using local citizens as a front to facilitate illicit financial flows and other forms of corruption. So I think that the risks are there where you have weaknesses that are not very robust or systems that are not very robust in terms of how they should regulate even political party financing. So So I think it is similar in that context and in that extent. And I think that in terms of going forward to deal with some of these things, I think it's important for there to be a strengthening of legislation to deal with the specific risks associated with lack of legislation for political party financing and things of that nature, but also the enhancing of regional cooperation, particularly when it comes to dealing with the transboundary nature of strategic corruption. So I think there are a lot of similarities in that sense, but there are also specific peculiar differences that relate to the context that I have described.
Thanks so much, Maurice. So that's really interesting. I feel like across the four speakers so far, we've kind of heard the general assessment of this being a globalized phenomenon, something that's manifesting in a number of different regions, tending to pick up on existing weaknesses and kind of manifesting in a lot of different ways. Multinodal money is flowing into and out of political systems. Quite often through something like illicit wildlife trafficking, procurement processes, a lot of different ways that money is moving around. Maybe for this round of questions, we can take a look at a deeper look at some of the research findings and think a little bit more about some of the gaps in our knowledge. So maybe Amy, I'd like to turn to you. Across the studies that USAID has commissioned into strategic corruption in Middle East, North Africa, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, are these efforts to exert corrupt influence, are they taking part through existing structures as well? Or are they operating in kind of new and parallel structures?
I think what we're seeing out of the studies is a lot of what Maurice was just talking about, what Ingrida was speaking to, that they are really taking advantage of existing vulnerabilities to think about how to engage in corrupt practices in sort of new ways. So across our studies, we saw that, for example, as Maurice mentioned, that there is legislation around political finance and transparency and reporting requirements, but there's just a lack of enforcement, which creates vulnerabilities and openings for foreign actors to have places for intervention. So in one of our case studies, in terms of thinking about party financing, we had several respondents who noted that all parties within that in that country were really operating in a pervasively corrupt financing, laundering assets through various sources of unexplained origins, using offshore companies for financial and the international financial system to conceal the sources of their political contributions. And there was substantial speculation among the respondents about where that funding was coming from, the opportunities for much of that funding to be coming in from foreign sources. One of the other case studies that we looked at in the Sub-Saharan Africa study really brought to light the fact that because of the really fragmented political system where wealthy individuals are self-financing their campaigns, along with the limited enforcement of political finance laws, there's a really strong opportunity for corrupt influence. The other place that we saw across the studies where there was a lot of opportunity for strategic corruption through existing vulnerabilities and structures was really around procurement systems. Election facilitation requires a lot of procurement of equipment, and often the suppliers for that equipment are based in external countries. A lot of the time we saw that the contracts lack a lot of transparency, and the interests of the foreign entities providing the equipment can be relatively unclear. When you couple this with the finding that electoral boards in many countries are politically captured and that there are weak financial controls, you really have this troubling opening for other foreign actors to be able to use corrupt practices and to be able to influence and exert a political influence throughout the election process.
So, Maurice, I'd really like to hear your perspective on this from civil society. We've talked about some of these vulnerabilities, the kind of ways that we see foreign malign actors trying to use strategic corruption to advance their interests. What is it that we can draw upon from civil society? How can civil society really help to inform our understanding of this issue, and how we can further bolster our collective defenses against it?
I think that's a brilliant question. And I think for me, when I look at civil society, I think one of the key strengths that we have as a civil society movement, if I can call it that, is that we are very much on the ground. And so we are in touch with what I can call the ordinary citizenry. So I think the specific, unique advantage that gives us is that it allows us actually to sort of take this very high-level discourse when we're talking about strategic corruption and to begin to bring it down to the level of the ordinary citizen. Like, what does strategic corruption mean for the ordinary citizen? Because what we have tended to see is that ordinary citizens tend to bear the brunt of a lot of these issues that we're talking about, where they are talking about strategic corruption and other things. And so they bear the brunt of what strategic corruption entails. And so for me, I think the key is that the strategic gap that we can fill as civil society is that we can take this discourse and sort of interpret it and see how it actually affects the everyday citizen. And that way you'll be able to sort of build a critical mass against strategic corruption. Because I think that as ordinary citizens, they need to be sort of given the opportunity and the leeway to be able to be part of the discourse as well. And so the specific unique attribute that we bring is that we have this connection with the ordinary citizenry, the ordinary citizens on the ground. And I think that until we begin to bring it home in terms of what this entails for the everyday livelihood struggles of the citizens, then it will be very difficult for us to make the sort of progress that we can make, even in terms of dealing with strategic corruption. And I think that as CSOs, we have that particular strength to be able to bring it home in that sense.
Thanks, Maurice. I think that's a really good point. If we talk about strategic corruption as being, like this tool of formal line actors to kind of push their aims around, on the world stage, it could be sometimes really difficult to try to make that understandable and to bring that down to that very personal level, because we would that's how you would build the coalitions against it. That's how a key part in mobilizing action is making sure that there's an understanding of the problem that's felt not just at this very high level of understanding, but also a kind of a visceral one as well. I'd like to kind of shift the focus of the conversation a little bit to looking now at some promising resilience strategies. Now we've kind of thought a little bit about our understanding of the problem and the limits of our understanding, and how some research is helping us identify some potential paths forward. Amy, what do you see so far as some of the things that are emerging from USAID's research into strategic corruption in Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa about really promising approaches to counter strategic corruption?
So I think that one of the things that comes out of this sense that strategic corruption is operating through existing vulnerabilities is that we have in place already some programs that are working in those spaces to be able to address the issues, though there is often not a direct emphasis or direct consideration of the unique challenges associated with strategic corruption being integrated into those approaches. Our Sub-Saharan Africa study noted that there have been very few full assessments of strategic corruption in election programming. If the problem itself is not fully understood, it makes it really difficult for the programming to be responsive to those types of challenges and the unique types of political economies that it creates. So that's one really particular need in terms of understanding the playing field. But this really creates an opportunity for us to think about strategic corruption and what it looks like, what that unique role is that it plays, and how we can address it in terms of programming. Some of the recommendations that came out of our studies are things like integrating strategic corruption into existing election support programming or future election support programming. Really thinking about how is it operating, what are the various power dynamics and incentives. So expanding the electoral oversight body's ability to focus on political finance tracing from abroad, for example. And then that is something that is often met with resistance by power holders. So one of the other recommendations that came out of our studies was to make sure that investigative journalists and civil society organizations are well equipped to address the challenges that are uniquely presented by strategic corruption. One of them is really making sure that there's the ability to work at scale. Strategic corruption is happening obviously beyond just a national level, and the ability of civil society organizations and investigative journalists to work at a transnational, a regional scale is particularly important. One of the particular challenges of that is that the data required to understand the problem and to do something about it is dispersed and often lacking across the various stakeholders. So there's a need to really understand at that scale, where's the data coming, or where are the funds coming from, what is their potential effect on elections and political finance. There were some other recommendations that came out of this study as well. So for example, thinking about how you integrate analyses of strategic corruption into early warning systems for electoral violence. The links between state fragility and conflict and strategic corruption tend to be very strong. So thinking, therefore, about how strategic corruption facilitates or creates openings for political violence is a really important potential area for exploration and future programming. As people have mentioned, as Maurice was mentioning, the ability to address the gaps in the legal framework is another really critical piece here, and thinking about how strategic corruption presents unique challenges for legal gaps in understanding political finance and in addressing challenges in political finance. But like I said, one of the really big challenges here is scale. That donors are primarily working at a national level, and a lot of these dynamics are taking place at a regional level or a broader transnationally networked level. And we need to be able to think about how we can adapt programming appropriately to work at the proper scales. One thing that we've been able to do in thinking about these dynamics regionally through the Sub-Saharan Africa study and the MENA study is understand a little bit how these dynamics play out at a regional level in different types of ways, in different types of environments, and create this opening for understanding the political economy that shapes those dynamics, and build out a regional perspective on what the operating environment looks like for strategic corruption.
Great, thanks, Amy. So a lot of great ideas there, engaging civil society, investigative journalism, embedding anti-corruption into elections programs, and then thinking, again, about scale and what we can do more to take on a transnational problem beyond just through national level programming. Ingrida, with the research that you're doing under the Global Accountability Program, Strengthening National Architectures activity, what are the indications of effectiveness of various approaches to combating strategic corruption that you're seeing emerging?
So first of all, I wanted to pick up on this terminology point that's been mentioned a couple of times, that strategic corruption is a very new term. It's about 5-ish years old. Even there are terms that capture similar elements that have been used before, but strategic corruption as such is quite novel. And therefore, there is not a huge amount of literature specifically on strategic corruption. We're looking at what that actually manifests like. Another point that came up a lot during our work is that a lot of institutions consider corruption from a domestic perspective. So that those international elements that are crucial to strategic corruption are not necessarily being considered by those institutions that are looking to combat corruption. Now, a lot of that internationally linked corruption, strategic corruption, does build on existing vulnerabilities, so that can be captured by and mitigated by strong enforcement systems that are designed to combat corruption at a domestic level. But there might be elements, and sometimes there are specific elements or ways of working that are not captured when international strategic corruption is not specifically considered. So those risk assessments are not necessarily being done for that type of corruption. Now, it's not just due to the novelty of the term, perhaps, but also, as Amy and others mentioned, it's a very kind of complex, multinodal approach. So strategic corruption does not happen from government A that is trying to directly influence government B through corruption or one kind of stakeholder. It can happen through a very complex system, a multinodal system, going through various types of organizations, institutions, the public sector, private sector, civil society. Lots of different jurisdictions might be used or passed through for that. So sometimes identifying exactly which ones of those nodes are linked to a strategic corruption network can be quite tricky. You don't have that clear data there. Sometimes strategic corruption is used to not to get people to do something, but to get people to not do something as well. So that can also be difficult to prove or identify at times. So it can be used to neutralize law enforcement capabilities or shape policy decisions or media capture. So lots of different organizations, and it's a very broad scope of our study, lots of different things to look into. But I will pick up on two elements. So one, institutional approaches. So we discussed legislation, very important to have strong legislation, but we also discussed that it's not enough. And that very much came up within our work. That it's important to understand the political dynamics of corruption and anti-corruption decisions, as Jen mentioned. Historically, we do see lower levels of action against higher level corruption, more strategic, grand corruption. It's easier, it's simpler to work on, to focus on the more administrative corruption. And also strategic corruption can very much serve to undermine some of those difficult political decisions that have to be made to invest significant resources in larger scale cases against corruption. So that can be used to essentially mean that there are not very many prosecutions to draw on or to look at for strategic corruption. We're also seeing that capacity building on its own is unlikely to be effective. So there's legislation needs, there's enforcement needs, but just capacity building is insufficient in its own. So that's because implementations of policies and procedures can be impeded by political interference, vested interests, and capture of institutions. We're also seeing within our work mandate overlaps and capacity constraints can complicate the pursuit of complex cases, which are expensive and require sophisticated skills and equipment. And there's also a need for long-term investment in both strategies and monitoring and evaluation. Some strategies that we're seeing are more of a declaration of will rather than actual programs. So we do need something specific to then be able to look back on, verify progress against, and measure key performance indicators against those strategies. The other point I'll pick up on is data. So as we're discussing, there are a lot of dots that are being connected to identify strategic corruption, which are not necessarily fully evident because proving that intent, the corruption being in order to further foreign policy aims, is quite challenging. So you need to connect the dots between different phenomena, different decisions that are being made, different financial flows. And risks of undue influence can be very poorly understood. But there are examples emerging where legislation, public reporting, and civil society have shed light on what's going on. For example, through lobbying practices and identifying what's going on, where who's meeting whom or influencing whom. And there's a lot of potential to build on that more. I think these are emerging practices on lobbying data in particular. In addition to data availability, I wanted to highlight data usability. So we do have some data, but in many cases, it's very difficult to actually use it effectively. We have spoken to people who essentially collate lots of different Excel sheets, whether it's on the investigation side or civil society side. The data is somewhere there, but it's in different formats. It's very difficult to actually aggregate and see a full picture. But we are also seeing some good examples. I think Lina mentioned data interoperability, real-time identification of permissibility of political donations in Lithuania, for example. That is quite kind of an interesting approach that could potentially be useful elsewhere as well. The final point on data that I wanted to mention is data sharing. So the Egmont Group frequently came up as an example of good practice in enabling international data sharing between financial intelligence units. A lot of the other institutions were quite jealous of that kind of an international network where that collaboration is working relatively effectively compared to what other types of organizations might have access to. So that kind of data sharing across different countries, different jurisdictions, different types of institutions could be something that would be really useful, I think, particularly in the context of combating strategic corruption.
Thanks so much, Ingrida. There's certainly a lot to think about and to kind of pick apart there. Already a number of resilient strategies emerging from a relatively nascent line of effort with the Global Accountability Program just recently launched. But certainly hearing a very strong point on the availability, usability, timeliness, and application of data, and certainly bringing a number of different approaches to this problem. Lena, I'd like to turn to you now for that, once again, this practitioner's perspective. The government of Lithuania has certainly had a focus on mitigating strategic corruption and malign influence for a significant period of time, but especially so since 2022. So could you tell us a little bit about some of the tools, the specific tools and strategies and policies that you've seen as the chairperson of the Central Election Commission that have been particularly effective or promising as a resilient strategy?
We publish a lot of information about donations, about expenditure, about political advertising on our website. This information is in readable formats. You can analyze, and we share this information with other institutions, with civil society, with NGOs. And one of most significant case was the scientific study using our information system about donations and information from Public Procurement Office about procurements. And because of noticed correlation between donors and winners of public procurement, we started the discussions about donations from legal entities, and the parliament took a decision because of this noticed correlation between the donors and public procurements. And also, I think it's very important prevention. The CEC uses the information system to collect all this information, to collect it during all campaigns, since the very beginning of political campaign. And some information is not publicly available, like in Lithuania, where donations are linked to 10% of declared income, and you don't know the income of donors. So information system gives this information to political campaign participants, and we can know about their donors. We can take informative decision if we can accept a donation or don't accept, and it helps to prevent breaches because of mistakes by mistake. If you don't know, you don't know. So it helps us. And also, NGOs uses our information system about donations. We make visualizations. We compare with information from other institutions to inform better civil society, to inform better voters, that we could take a better decision during election. And it's very important that our information is available from the very beginning of political campaign, not after election, but from the very beginning. All donations, all expenditures, we have to be declared within 10 working days after getting it. So it helps to collaborate with civil society to inform better voters before election. And I would say that the media, they also uses our information very quickly. We have some cases that political campaign participant, we register a donation, and the next day we have some article about the donors and so on. So it's very quickly.
Thank you, Lena. So I'm hearing a very strong focus on the importance of transparency, but also that data interoperability element, looking at political and campaign donors, but also procurement databases as being a pretty strong, effective strategy, a strong and effective resilience strategy. Maurice, previously I'd asked you a little bit about how CSOs, or civil society organizations, are helping us understand the problem of strategic corruption better. Can you tell us now, let's think about action. What are civil society organizations really doing to empower these resilience strategies? And especially if you could pick up on that transparency point that Lena had mentioned.
Absolutely. I think the first point to note is that CSOs are a very critical player in this discourse, and I think that there are always opportunities, what I can call intervention opportunities, like trying to identify and highlight at which points actually CSOs can intervene. I can give two very quick examples from my context, which is Zambia, and the first is that as CSOs, specifically as a TI Zambia, but together with other CSOs, we have had some very good collaboration with the state anti-corruption body, particularly on the advocacy around legislation or strengthening legislation to do with asset declarations of state officials. And so they have actually jumped on the bandwagon, so to speak, to support those calls from civil society. And I think the importance of this is that it potentially allows you to, to be able to explain or to review unexplained wealth when it comes to senior high-ranking officials, and this can have links or can be traced back to things like bribery, things like kickbacks. And from the reports that we have seen, either from the Financial Intelligence Center and other law enforcement agencies, these actually tend to be by foreign entities or foreign interests. So there is that angle. But the second one also is that as CSOs, we have been very forthwith in terms of working with information that has come from financial intelligence centers and other law enforcement entities. And so this has helped to bolster our advocacy around issues to do with beneficial ownership transparency, for example, so that you can sort of uncover that veil around who are the real owners of these companies that are facilitating illicit financial flows, money laundering, and other forms of corruption that is happening. And so there are avenues and opportunities through which as CSOs can intervene. And I think the important thing really is for us as CSOs to continually reflect on where we can actually be most effective in terms of being able to contribute to this discourse. But I think the opportunities certainly are there, but it's for us to sort of highlight and identify where we can actually intervene. And it can have some significant results, as the examples have shown.
Thank you so much, Maurice. Those are, there's so many really great ways that a number of players can be involved in this. Governments taking action, civil society organizations, really trying to empower those efforts, and also, as you had said, reflecting, continuing to reflect on effectiveness and how to make the most of their contributions. I think that's very important. We've only had a limited amount of time to discuss this issue. I feel like we could talk about strategic corruption all day. But alas, we only have a 90-minute session and want to keep some time for question and answer. So I'd like to ask a couple more questions, and then we'll turn to Q&A from the floor. But let's end by focusing on how to put some of these strategies into action, how to scale them, how to amplify these efforts. Ingrida, I'll turn to you for the first question. We've talked about how strategic corruption can be used by a variety of different malign actors for a variety of different policy goals. And so the vulnerabilities they target are quite specific to the context. But as we think about, with all the people gathered here in this room, with their, the institutions that they work for and represent, thinking about how they can play a bigger role, how much of some of these strategies can we, what kind of generalizable elements can we pull out of this? And how much do we really need to leave open for scoping a specific intervention for the specific context?
Thanks, Andrew. So I'd pick up on three generalizable recommendations that then become very specific, but the recommendations are quite broad. So first of all is considering the risks of strategic corruption. So those might be different in different contexts, but actually considering what are they. From what we've discussed, they're not necessarily explicitly considered within strategy documents or literature, institutional risk assessments. And we heard a very interesting example during our work where this is in relation to corruption risk specifically, but really illustrates how just if you're not considering those risks, you might not identify where that is happening. So a financial intelligence unit shared with us how they hosted a collaborative exercise with with the banking sector on corruption red flags. They noticed that from the suspicious activity reports that they were receiving, they were actually seeing corruption, but that wasn't being tagged or flagged within the suspicious activity reports. Only money laundering was. So they did an interactive exercise looking at how does corruption manifest within these contexts, where that is, what are the red flags, together with the banking sector, but also all the other institutions relevant that are working on investigations. And they came up with essentially a guidance document. And they said that after that, both because of that collaborative exercise they did and perhaps the guidance document, that reporting of corruption really increased. Not because there was more corruption, presumably, but because people knew what to look for, identified that as corruption. So very similarly, if we look for strategic corruption, look at what that might manifest like, where that is, what are the vulnerabilities that might be exploited, we might actually see a lot more of that happening in practice within institutions. So considering that risk is kind of the first recommendation. The second one is collaboration between institutions within various countries. And for strategic corruption, there might be more institutions that might be relevant to that discussion than just for corruption. So thinking about those that work internationally, that think of international corruption-related risks, so that includes security agencies, perhaps ministries of foreign affairs. That depends on who might have that insight, that understanding, and might be working on matters related to strategic corruption. And then data sharing between those institutions, collaboration, of course, will be quite important. And as Lina mentioned, data availability that the Central Election Commission has, showing political donations regularly, then allows the media to pick up on that and civil society to pick up on that and have that public discussion during the electoral period, not after that when the decisions have been made. The third point would be focusing on and building transnational networks and resources to combat strategic corruption. So by definition, strategic corruption requires multiple countries to be engaged. And if that's what happens on the perpetrator side, that's what needs to happen on the side of those that are seeking to combat that. But of course, it becomes very difficult due to different legislative frameworks, data sharing requirements, that memorandum of understanding. But that's something that really is necessary to identify and combat strategic corruption. So individuals might be offered properties or funds in foreign countries and foreign bank accounts, which local investigators might not be able to see. And that can be very difficult then to actually both identify those strategic corruption networks and instances, and also to combat that. In some cases, it's quite common for people to have dual citizenship. So it might be even easier for some individuals to have that property or funds in a different country, which can complicate law enforcement's work. So that international collaboration is really crucial. The other aspect to that is that these are often complex networks requiring complex investigations and approaches. So maybe an element of sharing skills, resources, tools at a regional level could also facilitate going after those really large cases that do involve multiple jurisdictions that require very specialist skills and resources that might not be readily fully available, particularly in smaller jurisdictions. So that kind of international collaboration can really enable that identification and to go after the strategic corruption.
Thanks, Ingrida. On your last point, I think you're, referencing a common refrain that we've had within the Anti-Corruption Center is that, it takes a network to fight a network. So really great to hear your thoughts on that, and especially that skill sharing that we can be investing in and regionally and across countries. Lina, speaking of networks, we understand that Lithuania is a member of a variety of different networks. And could you tell us a little bit about some of the fora and institutions that you're finding particularly useful as government representative when you're collaborating on mitigating strategic corruption?
Yeah, it helps us to build our capacities, and I think more than 10 years ago we had Greco recommendations, Greco evaluation, and it helps us to revise our framework, legal framework to eliminate loopholes, allocate institutional responsibilities, because we had some problems where some institutions which were responsible for control, but with duties were not very good divided. So these recommendations helped us to do it. And a couple of years ago, we had recommendations from OECD evaluation also about building capacities, about having better relations with other institutions, and it helped us to strengthen our system. Also, so these both organizations carry out systematic, not narrow field assessment, and it's very useful. But also, I think specific evaluations is very important, like recommendations of OSCE election missions helped us to introduce some limits for membership fees, and it's very narrow recommendations, but it helped us to go to the parliament to believe them in this recommendation. And also we benefit from participating in specialized networks of IFES or EU election network, because you can help, you can share your expertise, your experience with other institutions which do the same work. And also we participate in regional conferences because, because of geopolitical situation, because of a very common context, it's very important to participate in regional conferences to share regional expertise.
Thank you so much, Lena. All right, I think at this point we have about 20-25 minutes for a question and answer period. Just for efficiency's sake, I think what I'd like to do is to take maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time and then have the panel answer them all together. We have a couple of folks in the teal shirts who are passing microphones around the room, and I see 2 hands go up right away, right over here.
Hi, good morning. Slobodan Milic here with NDI. Thank you so much for this session, and I followed up closely. I'm very interested in a common perpetrator, political parties. It seems to me that most of the recommendations treat political parties as, in a cat and mouse game, they would be the mice and we would be the cat who try to catch them. My question to you is, would any of those, do you think that political parties can ever be part of the cat club, that they would be either self-regulating or maybe being part of a coalition that regulates other parties? And if yes, if they could be on the positive side, on the constructive side, which of those recommendations that you put forward here would apply, which would be valid for political parties? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Slobodan. I see 2 hands there. Maybe we could take these two questions here, and then. Oh, I'm sorry. Apologies.
Hi. Thank you so much. Ara Marcen, I work on defense and security issues. Amy, I found really interesting your reference to state fragility and how that can lead to political violence. Strategic corruption can lead to political violence. And I wonder if you can speak a bit more, or someone can speak a bit more on the defense sector and strategic corruption in the defense sector and political finance in the sector.
Excellent. All right, let's take one more question and then we'll turn to the panel.
Thank you, Duncan Haynes, Transparency International UK. I wonder if one of the challenges in addressing these vulnerabilities is the hypocrisy by which our politicians can embrace some of these tactics when they are deployed by our friends with friendly objectives. Compare and contrast, if you like, in the United Kingdom, the playbook of the European Azerbaijani Society and that of our friends in Gibraltar. It is hard to go after the former at the same time as embracing the inducements offered to British politicians from our friends in the latter. How do we kick the habit of some of these cozy relationships if we're to be more resilient to hostile threats?
All right. Okay, we have 3 great questions across a number of different issue sets. If I could recap them, if you'll forgive me for summarizing a bit. Political parties, the role of political parties and the potential for them to also be part of the problem, not just the kind of affected party from strategic corruption. Fragility and political violence, the role of the defense sector, and then finally, ensuring that there's a fair application of the rules and standards for allies and foes alike. Lena, maybe I could actually turn to you for the kind of first question about political parties and kind of how to really fully understand their role both as potential problem actors and also as the object of strategic corruption schemes.
Yeah, we have some investigations about various schemes because we need money, not illegal sometimes we use, but I think the main issue is to train political parties, but it's more useful to follow the rules, not to have a use from illegal financing, and it helps monitoring of activity of political parties. And if political parties, we understand better the situation, we have quite strong self-control system, because sometimes we notice that we receive a lot of notifications or complaints from persons who are affiliated with political parties, not by political parties themselves, but persons who are affiliated, and it helps us also. And we had a situation in Lithuania about agreement of political parties on transparency of political campaigns. It was, I don't remember, maybe 15 years ago, but it was very helpful. Also, earlier we had some declarations before political campaigns about fair election, about fair participation in election, not bribing voters and so on. And if all political parties are engaging in this, it helps to have really more fair election. And political parties, when we are engaged, we help voters to believe in election if we play fair game.
Thank you, Lena.
Yeah, maybe to reflect on that as well. I think it's an important question, and for me, political parties, yes, certainly have to be part of the solution. But I think the question that I always ask is on the how, and how effectively can we do that. The example that I have from my context is that, I mean, we have been working as part of our political integrity work with political parties from both, the opposition as well as the ruling party. And I think what has tended to happen, or the biggest challenge that we face, is that the interests of these political parties sometimes vary, and there can be a large variation within, the sort of interests that they have. And so that has been the most difficult situation for us. Like, how do you get them all to be on the same page, so to speak, and to sort of pull towards one direction? Because we find that even just amongst themselves, for example, the party that is in power now, when they were in opposition back then, which is the time at which we started this sort of work, the sort of language they were talking was completely different from what is being said now. So you have these competing interests which fluctuate over a period, and it's very difficult then to work with that and being able to sort of get them to be effective to contribute to this agenda. So yes, they should be part of the conversation, they should be part of the solution as opposed to just being the problem. But I think we always have to reflect on how effectively this can be, given the difference and diversity of interests that they always seem to have when it comes to this.
Thank you, Maurice. Amy, maybe we could just move right down the line. If you'd like to respond more on the political parties question, or take one of the other, respond to one of the other two great questions that we heard.
Yeah, I'll jump in on the state fragility question. So this was actually really interesting as part of our MENA study. The data sort of showed how different governance pathways relate to different approaches to corruption and transnational corruption and strategic corruption. One of the findings that came out of it was that when you have really fragmented governance pathways, then the need to constantly reconfigure coalitions of support creates a lot of openings for different types of transnational corruption, particularly the opportunity for strategic corruption. We saw across the countries that were examined that there was often a move towards an opening for strategic corruption and influence from external actors in return for additional security provision. And so when there is conflict, it creates all these opportunities that may not exist otherwise. One of the other things that came out of the study was the ways in which ongoing conflict and instability create opportunities for strategic corruption in the context of arms procurement. And that the way in which external actors own strategic interests in gaining access to those contracts creates opportunities for political influence and for strategic corruption. So there's a whole set of types of dynamics within those contexts that really create a lot of vulnerabilities to strategic corruption.
And I'll then pick up on Duncan's question, which I think is a really good one, that friendly stakeholders, friendly countries might also use some of those same approaches as maligned stakeholders might. And I think the key here is transparency. So all the transparency mechanisms that we have, from declarations of gifts and entertainment, if that's provided by different stakeholders, that might have a different effect on people's decision-making. I think transparency in lobbying as well is quite an important point, that it's where we are seeing additional kind of work on lobbying transparency. Lithuania has cross-declarations, for example, for both public officials as well as lobbyists to have to declare those meetings. And I think it's really making sure that those systems not only show who's meeting what, but for what purposes, and also normalizing that lobbying and engagement as part of the political democratic processes. As Lina mentioned, that political parties can increase people's trust in elections, strengthen participation in democratic processes. So that transparency in lobbying as well can be part of a healthy debate between different types of institutions, different stakeholders within society, speaking to lawmakers about influencing that process, which is a desirable part of democracy, but just having it out in the open, knowing who's behind those efforts, what they might be driven by. We're also looking from our work into information manipulation that is related to strategic corruption. And I think that's really where these points of the three questions do come up, that a key aim of information manipulation related to strategic corruption is to reduce trust in democratic institutions. And I think political party engagement of political parties, having people who participate in that, or in political parties and elections being seen as a positive element, rather than, oh, they're just doing that for their own personal gain to get a slice of the pie, that can be really strong, and political parties can play a very strong, can play a role in that. As Amy mentioned, we've also seen in the region those discourses that you need to accept corruption in return for stability. That was very much there, I think, and kind of debunking that it's not accepting corrupt frameworks and structures that can lead to stability, but quite the opposite can also be quite significant.
Thank you so much. All right, we can take another round of questions. I see Eka has her hand raised here. I also see one more hand raised over on that side of the room. Thank you.
Eka
Eka.
Tashilashvili, Senior Director, Dexis Consulting Group. A couple of observations and a question. I'll echo a bit with the misinformation-related part of what has been mentioned, and then draw your attention to the media scene. What we've observed in many countries, it doesn't take the political finance only to have a greatest impact, but then capture of the media through ownership by the local actors rather than foreigners, but then foreigners as well, when it comes to the companies or individuals. So I'd like to hear more a little bit if throughout your studies you have looked into that as well, because part of, in terms of strategizing how to mitigate the risk, is to have combined strategies on media and political finance. And then the digitalization element of that as well. I mean, we've seen in Ukraine quite a bit how digitalization of reporting of political finance has helped to generate data, but then transparency about the data. And then combination of different tools, political party financing and asset declarations, when the candidates have to report already and then submit asset declarations with the digital themselves, and then political party financing. It's consolidating the data, but then brings a different level of transparency to the thing. And advice on the CSOs. I come from a country which is subject of malign influence from a big bad neighbor, Russia, for a long time. So what we find in terms of great use on how CSOs could fight back against that influence is collaborative effort between think tanks who are more in international relations, geopolitics, security, and then those who are anti-corruption activists, because ultimately it's a different breed when we speak about strategic corruption. It's not just transnational corruption or, endemic corruption in any given country, but it seeks particular goal. It wants to change power dynamics on a geopolitical stage. So those who are well-versed in international relations and security issues and geopolitics, and if they combine efforts with anti-corruption activists, you have a better way of actually understanding the risks and then knowing how to combat in that way.
Thank you so much, Eka. I think that's a great point. We need to make sure we're not just saying civil society and using one phrase to encapsulate all the various actors within it. Thank you very much for that. We'll take one last question here and then move to the panel.
Thank you. My name is Beloved Chiweshe from Accountability Lab Zimbabwe. Maurice mentions the role that citizens can play, but I also wanted to ask if the research also touched on the role that citizens play in encouraging or pushing political parties into corrupt behavior. In most of these countries where politics is based on patronage, it is actually the citizens who put pressure on politicians to be corrupt so that they get material benefit from the election process. So my question was essentially around, did the research unearth anything around how citizens are actually driving politicians into corrupt behavior, especially considering that when they are out of office, most of them will come out broke? Thank you.
Thank you, Beloved. Those are really two fantastic questions to end on. So I'll open it up to the panel. Generally, we have the thinking of media capture by local actors and foreigners, the role of digitalization as a tool to generate data and promote transparency, and then finally, can citizens also play a role as a negative actor in this space in pushing politicians toward corruption? I'll open it up for anybody who would like to begin. Ingrid, please.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on that. And Eka, I think what you've mentioned really resonates with what we're looking at. So in terms of the capture of media ownership, that is one of those points that we're looking at. So our study is quite broad in terms of looking at the public sector institutions, including the regulatory bodies and law enforcement and judiciary, private sector, media, and civil society. So we're really looking within all those different sectors how strategic corruption is attempted and what are the vulnerabilities and strengths that can help mitigate that. And media ownership has very much come up within our work. This study is still ongoing, and one of the things that we are currently doing is doing a systems map of all the different stakeholders that are involved, as well as the the flows of influence and finance between them. So really trying to map out what can this look like, what does this look like? And media ownership is one of those points, and we hope to have this in a few months towards the end of the year to really have a bit of a visualization of how all of that moves around, because these are really complex movements involving lots of stakeholders. The point of combination of tools for transparency from the reporting political finance and asset declaration, really important one. That's definitely something that could be very much an asset. And the point on collaboration that you mentioned in terms of having stakeholders that work on the national security, geopolitics side, talk to those that work on anti-corruption. That's I think, one of those key strengths that, particularly looking at strategic corruption as opposed to corruption, can bringing those stakeholders to the table, looking at what are the risks and what's the situation from their point of view that can actually add another piece of the puzzle to the whole picture. So yeah, very crucial points that you raised.
I can jump in on the question about civil society. This is actually something that was touched on a bit in the MENA and Sub-Saharan Africa studies in terms of how citizens engage around issues of corruption. But I'd actually kind of point more towards a recent study that we did around corruption and in its relationship to the kind of social and behavior change approaches. So in that work, we kind of looked at what are the underlying norms that reinforce some of these behaviors around corruption, and getting into how do you understand how to message with civil society that these processes are not normative, that they are not inevitable. And thinking about making sure that the messaging that is created in such a way that it doesn't make corruption seem like something that is bound to happen and that you should participate in because it's just going to happen, so you should get your own due. And making sure that that messaging is more productive around understanding, this goes back, I think, also to Maurice's point, what are the challenges that civil society and citizens on the ground face as a result of strategic corruption, and making sure that some of those connections are made and that they're made very clearly. That was something that came out across that research.
Thank you, Amy. Maurice or Lena, any thoughts on some of these questions?
Well, maybe just I really like Eka's interventions and suggestion for how as CSOs we should enhance the collaboration with think tanks and ourselves as anti-corruption activists. I think that is brilliant and something that we certainly need to take up. But also, I like the point by Beloved about the role that citizens play in sort of advancing some of this. I think it's something that also came out quite clearly in a study that we did as TI Zambia, which was called the Cost of Politics Study. And so one of the things that the politicians were actually saying is that it's the citizens who are making us corrupt, because they tend to see election time as a time for them to derive personal benefit from the politicians. But I think that is a narrative that the politicians would really like to push and to sort of almost like give themselves a sense of inevitability about it, that there's nothing we can do, it's your citizens who are. So I think there's a lot of work even for us as civil society to sort of start to work to change that narrative. I think there are elements related to maybe issues to do with poverty and how politicians maybe take advantage of poor setups and poor communities to sort of buy votes in that sense. But so I think there is a lot of leeway for us to maybe do a lot more research in this field in order to see the dynamics at play when it comes to resource poor settings. And I think that is a critical thing to look at as well.
Ingrid, I see you raising a finger. Maybe I can go back to you, and then I'll go to Lena for a final round.
I just briefly wanted to pick up on that, because one thing that did come up in our work in Europe and Eurasia is particularly the costs that might be associated with investments into, for example, energy independence that can be quite expensive in the shorter term for longer term gains. So not exactly the same kind of challenge, but I think citizens accepting that in the shorter term, energy might be more expensive in some countries, while energy sources are being diversified away from one supplier that might use that energy sources for all sorts of political gains. But that, in some countries, was accepted more easily by citizens, where they maybe saw the more immediate threat or what that energy dependence could be used for. In other countries, it might have taken a bit longer to convince the public to accept a slightly higher energy price. But I think that kind of messaging with longer-term goals versus shorter-term immediate gains is something that is kind of, with slight variations, is applicable across context as well. Just wanted to add that.
That's great. Thanks so much, Ingrida. Lena, any responses that you'd like to share on those last couple of questions?
I can just say that we use information technologies quite long, and we have all the declaration, I don't know, since 2000, and we publish it for all the time. So it's very useful even for media when we make some researches about the decisions taken now, but in the past we see some affiliations, and we use our information system. So I can just agree with you about these instruments, how useful they are, and how helpful all institutions.
Thank you so much. All right, that brings an end to the Q&A. So thank you so much. What an exciting way to start the IACC. I'd like to now just turn to Jen for a couple of closing thoughts, and then we'll wrap up our session.
Great, thank you so much. And first and foremost, could we give a round of applause to our panelists? Thank you so much for your sharing the research, the data, the knowledge, and also the lived experience of confronting this challenge. I started out by noting that strategic corruption is in many ways not so different from the corruption that so many of us here in this room have been fighting for so long. And I will also note, though, that we heard today that there are unique aspects to strategic corruption that make this a distinct phenomena. And so I'd like to put out the idea that in a certain way, strategic corruption is a microcosm of everything we are fighting on corruption, because it exposes the way that concrete vulnerabilities, systemic vulnerabilities across all public institutions, across political culture, across political parties and finance, across our banking and financial and judicial and legal institutions, the way those vulnerabilities can translate into concrete harm to our democracies. Again, getting back to that idea that this is not just about economic gain, it's not just about siphoning off resources, all of which is already bad enough. It is about the corrosive effect of this kind of systemic onslaught on our democracies and on our institutions. And we heard today about some of the approaches that are emerging as ways to address it. And many of them will sound familiar to folks in this room. Public procurement, strengthening disclosure, the use of digital technologies, looking at this issue systemically across sectors, including high-risk, high-vulnerability sectors like extractives, linkages to transnational pieces. I will note that this session being sponsored by Millennium Partners as the implementer on our GAP program, our Global Accountability Program, GAP, we named it aptly, was intended at addressing the gaps, the vulnerabilities that exist at the country level that leave countries exposed to all kinds of transnational corruption dynamics. And this is a particularly pervasive and insidious one. So I would like to thank our panelists for helping us start to unpack this and encourage all of you to learn more about what we are doing on this. I know others are doing work as well. I see Basel here has done some very interesting work in this area as well. And just thank you for being here today at today's opening session. Thanks so much.